Greetings, this is Lecture 10 on the Four Gospels. You may have noticed by now that I'm spending quite a bit of time on the New Testament, especially the Gospels. Well, that is my area of study, so I love to share what I know about the Gospels with you. So this lecture is expanding on what the book talks about in the chapter on the Gospels. So you can go back and read it's pages 74 to 79 in the Christianity book. So it's a short section on the Gospels, and I want to expand it a little bit. But make sure you do listen to this because this stuff is going to be on your exam. So we've talked a bit about genre, how there are different types of literature in the Bible. The genre of Gospels is kind of its own thing. There hadn't been anything written exactly like it before they were written. But they are similar to some ancient literature. For example, there is a type of biography written by the Romans called Roman lives. And the structure is pretty similar to the way the Gospels structure their stories. So there's a brief origin story of a famous person when they were born, and then it kind of fast forwards to their major life contributions. And then the Roman lives includes like teachings and philosophy of the person, and then there's details of the person's death. So the Gospels follow this pattern of the Roman lives, like skipping over childhood and focusing on death and teachings and things like that. So there is a lot in common between the Gospels and the Roman biography. Please note that the way that biography is written in the ancient world is not the same way that biography is written in the modern day world. They are not trying to report exactly word for word dates, places, the way that we tend to. They want to capture the picture of the person's life, and so they're going to leave some things out. They're going to maybe even move events around in history, and they're going to focus on how can I tell this person's story that best captures their character. And so this is what the Gospels are doing with Jesus, and this is why we have 4 of them, because they have different perspectives on how to tell this story about Jesus. But they also do something that is more than what the Roman lives do, and that is to give a good news announcement. The word in Greek is euangelion, good news announcement. And so they're not just telling Jesus' life story. The Gospels want to also tell about Jesus' good news, the message, and what is the good news. We talked about it in the last lecture. That is the good news that the kingdom of God has come near, and Jesus is inaugurating a new way of life, the reign of God in the world. And so that's the good news. And then Jesus announces it by teaching about it, by healing, showing what God's presence in the world does. It offers healing to people, and then also ultimately by showing that love is the center of God's message to humanity, and that culminates in Jesus's sacrificial death that shows his love for God and also his love for humanity. So there's one sort of critical issue in the background that scholars have been talking about for a long time, and that is the fact that we have 4 different Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they all tell a story a little bit differently, but they have a lot in common as well. So they'll have different perspectives and themes, each Gospel, and then they are written in different time periods, after anywhere from 30 to 60 years after Jesus' life. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular have many stories in common, and also many sayings, and they have a very similar order. And so we have always tried to figure this out. This is what scholars spend their whole lives studying to try to figure it out, and we call this the synoptic problem. So the synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they see together. Sin optic, seeing optic together, sin. So here it is in a nutshell. Mark has 661 verses total, but 606 of those are found in Matthew. 308 of them are found in Luke. So Mark only has 31 verses that are unique to Mark. And so scholars have explained this by saying that Matthew and Luke probably use Mark as a source. So Mark was written first, Markan priority is what we call that. And then it was sort of distributed around, and then the authors of Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark as they began to write their Gospels, and so they used it sort of as a template. They added on things and took things away, but that they used Mark. There's another problem, though, and that is that Matthew and Luke share about 250 verses that are not in Mark. So they obviously didn't both get those from Mark. So here's the major, maybe it's a maybe people have come to a synthesis of this, but this is the major hypothesis that scholars believe about the synoptic problem. And that is that Mark was written first, and then there's another document that we actually don't have anymore. It was we think maybe a document that had a lot of sayings of Jesus in it, and we call that Q, and that stands for Quelle, which is the word in German for source. So it's another source. So Matthew and Luke both drew from Mark, so you can see that with the arrows, and then Matthew and Luke both drew from Q, that saying source, and then they had their own material. M is Matthew's material and L is Luke's material. So this is just a hypothesis about how the Gospels got their information, how they used their sources in order to tell the story of Jesus. So we're going to start with the Gospel of Mark. If you're reading in the Bible, the first Gospel you come to is Matthew. It starts with Matthew, but that is not chronological. You'll note as we go through the New Testament that the books are not arranged chronologically. So Mark is actually the first one. So we'll study that one first, and we are going to watch the video for Mark here. We won't watch the other videos because we won't have time, but this is a really succinct look at the Gospel of Mark.
The Gospel according to Mark is one of the first accounts of the life of Jesus, and our earliest historical traditions link this book to a Christian scribe named Mark, or John Mark. He was a co-worker with Paul and a close partner with Peter. And in fact, an ancient church historian named Papias, he recalls that Mark had collected all of the eyewitness accounts and memories of Peter and then shaped them into this account. But Mark didn't just randomly throw the pieces together. He's carefully designed this story of Jesus. In the first line of the book, Mark makes this claim about Jesus. It's the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now what's interesting is that this is the only time Mark is going to tell you what he thinks. For the rest of the book, he's going to influence you by simply putting Jesus' actions and words in front of you and showing you how other people react to him. Now Mark's designed the story of Jesus as a drama with 3 acts. The first one set in Galilee, the third one is set in Jerusalem, and the second act shows Jesus on the way from one place to the other. And each of the acts focuses on a repeated theme. So in Act 1, everybody's blown away by Jesus, and they're wondering, who is this Jesus? In Act 2, it's the disciples who are struggling to understand what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. And then in Act 3, we watch the surprising paradox of how Jesus becomes the Messianic King. Let's just dive in and you'll see how it unfolds. After the opening line, Mark begins with a quotation from the ancient prophets Isaiah and Malachi, who said that God would send a messenger to Israel to prepare them for when God would show up himself to rescue his people and become their king. And Mark introduces John the Baptist as that messenger, and then right when you expect God to show up personally, Mark introduces Jesus. And as he comes onto the scene, the heavens open, God's Spirit descends on Jesus, and God says, "You are my beloved Son." After this, Mark places in front of us a summary of Jesus' core message. He went about Galilee announcing the good news that God's kingdom has come near. And Jesus is carrying forward the story from the Old Testament scriptures about God's rescue operation for his world. Through Jesus, God is restoring his reign over the world by confronting and defeating evil and its hold on people's lives, and then by inviting them to live under his reign by following Jesus. From here, Mark's given us a big block of stories showing us Jesus' power as he brings God's kingdom. He goes about healing people whose bodies are sick or broken or under the oppression of dark spiritual powers. And Jesus even does something that for Jewish people only God has the right to do. He forgives people's sins. And Jesus' actions here produce lots of different responses. So some people follow him and become his disciples. Other people don't know what to think, and still others reject him completely, especially Israel's leaders who accuse him of blaspheming God and being empowered by evil. But Jesus isn't surprised by these responses. In fact, he draws attention to it. In chapter 4, Mark has collected many of Jesus' parables about the hidden, mysterious nature of God's kingdom. And Jesus says that his message is like seed falling on different types of soil. Some are receptive, some are not. Or it's like a mustard seed that's very tiny. It seems insignificant, but then it grows huge and surprises everyone. Jesus' point is that he really is the Messiah, bringing God's kingdom, but it doesn't look like what anybody expected. And this growing confusion about Jesus among the crowds is connected to a key idea Mark emphasizes at the end of Act 1, that even among Jesus' disciples there's confusion. Even they are struggling to grasp who Jesus really is, and that brings us to Act 2. It begins with a crucial conversation. Jesus takes the disciples aside and he asks, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter speaks up, saying, "You're the Messiah." But it becomes clear that for Peter this means that Jesus is a victorious military king from the line of David who will rescue Israel from the Romans. But for Jesus to be the Messiah means that he's the suffering servant king of Isaiah 53, who will bring God's rule by giving up his life in Jerusalem. And the disciples, they don't get it. They think following King Jesus is going to mean fame and status and importance, and Jesus makes it clear that following him is actually like dying, like carrying your own cross. It means rejecting violence and pride and selfishness and giving one's life out for others in acts of service and love. He has the same conversation with them 2 more times, and it all culminates in Jesus' important statement that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant and give his life as a ransom for many. The disciples still don't get it. They respond in confusion and fear. And so here in Act 2, Mark has placed another key story that echoes the book's introduction. Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up to a mountain, and he's suddenly transformed. He's radiating with light and glory, and a cloud envelops them. Now, this is just like the glory of the God of Israel that showed up long ago on Mount Sinai. And then the 2 prophets who stood in God's presence on Mount Sinai, Moses and Elijah, they appear next to Jesus as God announces again, "This is my beloved Son." Now, by placing this story in the middle of all these conversations in Act 2, Mark is making an astounding claim that Jesus, God's Son, is the physical embodiment of God's own glory. And in Jesus, the glorious God of Israel is going to become king by suffering and dying for the sins of his own people. It's a puzzling claim that confuses and scares the disciples as they leave the mountain. Which brings us to Act 3. Jesus makes a very public royal entry into Jerusalem for Passover. People are hailing him as the Messiah. Then he enters into the temple courtyard and he asserts his royal authority by running out the thieves and crooks and stopping the sacrificial system. Then this kicks off a whole week of Jesus debating and confronting the leaders of Israel, condemning their hypocrisy, and so they set in motion a plan to have him killed. And Jesus warns his disciples, predicting that Jerusalem and its temple will be destroyed within a generation, and his disciples will be persecuted just like him, until he returns one day to bring God's kingdom fully over the world. And it all leads up to the final night. Jesus has his last Passover meal with the disciples, a symbolic meal that told the story of Israel's liberation from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And Jesus takes these symbols and he gives them new meaning. They point to the liberation from sin and death that will happen through the death of the suffering servant Messiah. From here, the story rushes forward to Jesus' arrest, his trial before Israel's priests and the Roman governor Pilate, all resulting in Jesus' crucifixion. And it culminates in a key scene that matches the important scenes from Acts 1 and 2. Except this time, it's darkness that descends, not a cloud. And instead of the divine voice from heaven, it's Jesus' voice crying out before he dies. And then most surprising is that it's a Roman soldier who sees Jesus die, who grasps and then announces who Jesus is. This man was the Son of God. He's the first person in the story to recognize the story's shocking claim about Jesus' identity, that it's the crucified Son of God who's the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, who died for his friends and for his enemies. After this, Jesus' body is placed in a tomb, and on the first day of the new week, 2 women from his disciples come to the tomb, and they discover that the tomb is empty. The stone is rolled away. And an angelic man informs them that Jesus isn't here, that he's risen from the dead. And so he orders them to go and tell this good news to the other disciples, that Jesus is alive, that he'll meet them back up in Galilee. And the women, they're freaked out. Mark says that they fled.
We are not going to finish this video. It's okay. We'll talk about the ending of Mark in the next video.